All right, this is our first KCS talk for this semester, and I'm very proud to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Seth Parker, and the title, the subject that he's going to talk about today is the title is to Herculaneum and Beyond, the Frontier Challenges of Virtual Unwrapping. The technique of virtual unwrapping was actually developed here by a team led by Dr. Brent Seals, and Seth is the major force of the team. Okay, this technique is important because you don't have to wrap a scroll to read the content of the scroll. Okay, and this would change the I don't know how much it would change the the industry in that area, but we are going to see the current status of this this technique here. So let's welcome today's speaker, Dr. Seth Parker.
All right. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Am I all good? All right, unmuted. All right, perfect. Thank you all for being here today. This talk was a long time in preparation. I think Dr. Chang tried to get me on the docket last year, and it never quite worked out with the timing. And so we looked last semester and thought, okay, we're going to get me on the docket, and it never worked out with timing. And then we finally scheduled it for last Wednesday, right in the middle of what turned out to be a snowstorm. And so here we are, rescheduled for like the fourth time. But I'm finally glad to be able to sit here and talk with you about virtual unwrapping and the work that we are doing in Educe Lab and around the world with other partners. So the title of my talk is To Herculaneum and Beyond, because the large part of this project focuses on the Herculaneum scrolls, which you may or may not have heard about, and we will talk about those. But really, the core of the research here is a process called virtual unwrapping. And virtual unwrapping was really developed to deal with something called the invisible library. So we all go to the library and we check out books, but the key thing about the books that we can check out is that we can open those books, right? I hope everyone goes to the library. By the way, I see some, chuckles. Not everyone goes to the library. I do. I like to open books, but we can't open all of our books. And in fact, every library and museum around the world has some sort of object where we can't interact with it the way we actually want to, in particular textual materials. There are lots of damaged manuscripts, like this medieval manuscript on the left, or this burnt scroll on the right, where the content of these materials is locked inside, it's still present, but we can't read it. And so in some sense, that text is invisible to the eye. It's still there, but we can't see it. And chief among this collection is the Herculaneum scrolls. Now, this is perhaps not as exciting as something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has gotten lots of international renown over the years. But the Herculaneum scrolls is the only existing library from antiquity. You could think of it as a little bit like if you uncovered the Library of Alexandria, that is the Herculaneum scrolls. It was an actual library, not just scrap pieces of papyrus or scrolls or books that have been sort of left around. This was a collection. And the reason we have it is because it was located near Pompeii. This is near Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius. So when Vesuvius erupted and covered Pompeii in 79 AD, all of the pyroclastic flow, of course, covered Pompeii. What we may not know is Pompeii is here, and there was this whole surrounding region which was also affected by that eruption. And Herculaneum was here on the edge and was itself covered, but covered by different sorts of material. So while in Pompeii, all of the people who were there were sort of left in this solidified state, which is very tragic to think about, Herculaneum was covered with a lot of ash and mud. And in that intense heat of ash and mud, a lot of things in that area carbonized. In a vacuum, when you have carbon-based materials, if you heat it intensely, it doesn't burn. It carbonizes and turns to charcoal, essentially. So that's what happened in Herculaneum. Herculaneum is very similar to Pompeii in that you can go visit it today. This is the site of the excavations. This is a few miles from the coastline now because Vesuvius erupted. But this used to be a beach resort town for a lot of the Roman elites of the period. And so this little area where my mouse is actually would have been the beach. And now it's many, many miles inland. I would suggest, if you ever make it to the Bay of Naples, to go to Herculaneum. It is in and of itself a very remarkable site to visit. Drastically different in sort of state of preservation from Pompeii, but still also quite striking and very beautiful. So in the town of Herculaneum, they, at some point in the 1700s, there was a villa that was excavated, a large villa. And in that villa, there was found a large collection of hundreds of scrolls. At first, they didn't know they were scrolls. They actually thought they were carbonized pieces of wood, and so they burned quite a few of them on their campfires when they were doing excavations. And at some point, someone dropped one, and it broke open, and they realized, oh, there's text on this thing that just broke open. Maybe we shouldn't be burning these. So then the excavations began to sort of recover as many of the scrolls as we possibly could. And that actually leads to what we see here. This is an image of one of the Herculaneum scrolls, and it looks like a chunk of charcoal, because that's physically what it basically is. At some point, though, because we knew there was text there was a large effort to do physical unwrapping on these scrolls. And this is over hundreds of years, this process was performed on the scrolls. This is an entire machine called Piaggio's machine, where the scroll would be placed on a sort of floating table, and they would attach little leads to some rope with glue, and then pull those ropes up and over a pulley system. And basically, over a long period of time, some weights down at the bottom would slowly pull the scroll down while holding the top leads in place. And the idea was that you could just, unwrap the scroll by letting nature do its thing, by letting gravity pull the scrolls down. And that worked somewhat. For a lot of scrolls, you could actually recover large sheets of material. And in fact, the vast majority of the Herculaneum collection that we have has been physically unwrapped in some way, shape, and form, but with intense amounts of damage to this material. So this would be one unwrapping in its fragmentary state. They're not all this bad, but most of them are this bad. And there are about 3,500 open trays of this type of material in Naples right now that scholars have been working on, classicists have been working on, to translate and to understand for a long period of time. This is so carbonized, though, and you can see it's very difficult to see any text. But under infrared light, you can take a passage such as this and illuminate that Greek text quite clearly to be read. Now, this is just the open problem, though. And there's a lot of damage that happens when you open these scrolls. And of course, we want to avoid all of that damage. So the question is, can we do all of this work non-invasively? Well, the obvious answer now, not so obvious when Dr. Seal started this process perhaps 25 years ago, was yes, actually we can. And what you're looking at here is the first evidence of Greek text extracted non-invasively from a Herculaneum scroll. So how did we get here? We're going to talk about that. But now, if we have this small fragment, the question is, can we scale this up to a full scroll? And can we scale it up to all of the Herculaneum scrolls? And there are about 300 that are still in their completely wrapped state, that were too badly damaged for that Piaggio method, for all the other physical interventions, too badly damaged for those. So all we have left now are really digital methods. So to answer this problem, we developed, over the last 25 years, a process called virtual unwrapping, an engine for discovery. Originally, when we conceived of this, it was very much a linear pipeline. You sort of do all of these steps in order, and you get out a unwrapped scroll at the end. But we've sort of realized that this is actually sort of a virtuous cycle here in the middle. We first have to acquire some sort of data about these objects, some sort of scan that shows us the internal structure and the internal content. And we settled on X-ray microcomputed tomography. So very much like the CT scans that you get when you go to the hospital, but at a much higher resolution. Right? At a hospital, you might be having pixel sizes of about 1 millimeter in size, or multiple millimeters. Here we're talking about micrometers, and often 15, 10, we're even getting down into 1 or 2 micron per pixel in these new scans that we're acquiring. So that's the first stage. And then in the middle, you have this cycle where really all the computation happens, where you have a segmentation problem, where you have to identify the wraps of the scroll. You have a flattening problem, where you then have to project that onto a flat plane so you can view it as if it's unrolled. And you have a texturing problem, identifying the ink and putting it on that flattened surface so you can read it. A lot of the advancement over the last 5 or 6 years is really focused on this middle part of the process. Flattening is a pretty well-studied, yes? Where is it? Like, I can't see where it is. Further down? Yeah, it's going through my shirt, so I have to move it down a button. Right there. How about that? Is that a little better if I'm doing this? There you go. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the development over the last 5 or 6 years has really been in this middle part of the process that I've highlighted here, improving our scans, and then improving on the segmentation and texturing problem. Flattening is actually very well studied in computer graphics, and so we sort of piggyback on a lot of advancements that are already happening there. We don't really think about that as much right now. Segmentation and texturing, though, are the real problems. So we'll start with the basics of CT scanning, so you can get a better sense of the data that we're looking at. If you have a scroll and you want to CT scan it, you have an X-ray detector, and you expose your scroll to X-rays, and that acquires a attenuation image on the other side, which shows you this is where, this is how this scroll absorbed X-rays as they pass through. It's sort of a shadow image of the entire internal structure of this scroll. If you want tomography, full 3D data, you rotate the scroll, and you acquire X-ray projections from all 360 degrees. And then you can use that to reconstruct computationally the entire internal structure of that object. And now we have the scroll in cross-section. And in fact, it's a full 3D data set. So this is now going through all of the cross-sections of this particular scroll. And you can see the intense internal structures that are present in the Herculaneum scrolls. So you could imagine in a nice case where you have a very cool spiral, that you could just map a spiral onto each individual slice. But here we have a spiral that's broken and deformed and going in and out of each slice. It's not actually, perpendicular to our slice plane. Very, very complicated internal structure. But if you put all these images together, it is, in fact, a 3D shape that you could slice through in any orientation. So to handle this spiral structure, remember our first goal is to find the wraps of this particular scroll. We go through a process called segmentation. And segmentation we think of as a very piecewise thing at the moment. It's very difficult to find all of the wraps all at once. So instead, we propagate over many, many slices a 3D shape of what we can actually follow. And this is a semi-automated process. We have a human in the loop who sort of creates the first path, and then we have various algorithms that propagate that path through the scroll using, this is sort of a drop-in thing. There are many algorithms to do this, so you can decide which algorithm to use. You let it propagate, and then when it gets off, the human corrects it and keeps on going. Because inevitably, with this sort of internal structure, it does get off. But there are problems where even a human can't actually make a good decision about what you should do with the internal structure. This, in particular, is a great example. There is damage inside the scroll where a gap has been formed, and the papyrus internally has broken apart. And in those circumstances, we need to start doing something a little bit more interesting. Again, this is another interesting region. This is the same sort of cross-sectional region slice view that you saw before, but in this one, if we're slicing like this, our papyrus page has also turned into that slice plane and is now coplanar with our slice plane. So we're actually looking at the surface of a scroll right directly in that view, or perhaps actually inside the surface of a scroll. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the surface. And then in the CT scans, the layers are just incredibly close together. And it's incredibly difficult to know where is an individual layer, where does it begin, where does it stop, even when it is actually perpendicular to our slice plane. These are the major segmentation challenges. And when you look at, and this is a close-up view of the center of one of those cross-sections I showed you before. When you look at this, and you start in the middle, you might say to yourself, I can start tracing these wraps. And I get, well, getting ahead of myself, I get to about here before I realize this is not possible for me to follow. Just visually by myself, it's just not possible. And when you consider along the length of the scroll, that you have all of this warping internal structure to deal with, like these waves, it seems impossible. So where the advancement is happening here is really that the raw data on its own is too complex. We need to simplify this into certain special representations or feature space that we can then piece together to make an actual scroll structure. One of the very strongest features, actually, though, is the fiber structure of the papyrus. Papyrus is a very regular-ish grid of papyrus fibers overlaid on each other. One side of the page, like the front side of the page, is in one orientation, and the back side of the page is in the opposite orientation. And so those two alternating patterns actually can tell you quite a bit about the internal structure, even when that structure is undulating and wavy. So a lot of effort has gone into fiber following, we call it, and trying to piece together surfaces from this sort of fiber structure. Another alternative is to let a neural network do it, because of course AI solves everything right now. So we should just let a neural network figure out what's the most important thing. This is a simplification of a lot of the surface structure that came out of an NNU net that was applied to this sort of surface following. And the idea here is not that this output is exactly correct, but that it's much easier to deal with than this output. So we've simplified the structure, and this provides us better cues about local structure than what the other does. So what's happening now is we have all of these representations, and we want to start combining them together and create nice surfaces using all of the representations that we've sort of pre-processed. The major algorithm for doing that is called sheet tracing. It is really an optimization technique over, I want to combine all of these surface representations into a single fitted surface, and I want to weight the output of all of those representations. And I'm going to do that by producing a locally planar patch and then growing that out using these representations as my guides. There's a piece of software out there called VC3D where this is all implemented. And you can see a lot of these grown surfaces still not entirely, where's my mouse? There it is. Still not entirely blended together, but you can see a lot of the local surfaces that have been fit. And the goal is to try to grow these together into a single representation. And as the growing happens, we can visualize that as a flattened plane. Every time we have a surface in the 3D volume, we can sort of instantly flatten that and texture it so you can sort of see what the surface looks like. So this is an animation showing one of those surface patches growing, but in flattened space when it all gets flattened out. So it sort of starts with a nice papyrus structure and slowly grows at the edges. And you can still, there's some gaps, but you can still see a nice regular crosshatch of that papyrus structure growing on that surface. Now again, we're not necessarily looking for ink in this step. We're really looking for consistent surface structure. You can find, as you watch, you can see places where like things disappear. And that's actually because there's still a human in the loop coming in and saying, this region that you've grown into is incorrect. And I want to remove that from a growing surface and only continue down long paths that are actually high priority, basically, that are good. And this is much better than the draw a little piece, let a person let it propagate for a bit, fix it, loop. This is much, much faster. Mm-hmm. It's sort of user selected at runtime. So it is like I have many different surface representations, and they're growing over time, the number of surface representations. And so it's sort of a weighted distribution. It's not a mesh. It is actually, it could be, well, it could be a mesh. It could, in this instance, it's actually a volume, a 3D volume, where you have at each coordinate an estimate, basically, of local surface connectivity. So in this case, right, this is radial space in terms of pixel coloring, radial space relative to a center point that's not here, radial and distance. Mm-hmm. It's implicit. It's implicit in the volumetric space, discretized volume. So you can think of it as, like an occupancy grid, but we need more information than that. So in that, adjacent layers, like if I move from this layer to the next layer, that's actually still one surface in terms of connectivity because I've wrapped one wrap all the way around. But I don't want to create a join across that gap because that doesn't actually represent the local topology that I'm trying to follow. So that's where it becomes a little bit more than just occupancy or connected component. It actually has to be a little bit more interesting about local topology connections. Does that make sense? That's what this one is. Another one actually could be a mesh. So like sometimes this fiber following is actually a mesh where we have isolated specific fibers and we mesh each of those individually, and now we have sort of a meshed surface that we can join together using local topology as well. But then how that all informs the final decision of I want these patches to merge is a sort of user decision at runtime based on, really on intuition about working with the data.
So at this point, you don't need anybody to work with you who knows how to interpret ancient language.
No. And in fact, most of virtual unwrapping is content agnostic. That's it's really our goal, is that there will be a phase where once you actually have text and you are seeing the text, you can use that in this cycle. You can use that to improve your segmentations. For example, if I have a sentence and I can tell that half of the words drop off and disappear in the middle of it, but I've identified the sentence, then I know that either that is missing in the data or my surfaces are wrong, and my surfaces are in the wrong spots because it's not showing me text. Or my algorithm for texturing is wrong because the surface is in the right spot, but it doesn't detect the text.
At this point, all the information is just about structure.
It's mostly about structure, yes. Mm-hmm. Specifically for the segmentation task, we've broken it down into these stages so that we can handle each task independently. Identifying surfaces is independent from identifying text. Identifying text is a follow-on problem, which I'm about to talk about. Mm-hmm. So where is segmentation moving after this? Well, we're still only building, practically, we're still building larger, small surfaces of this role. And moving that out of independent components to some sort of global optimization is sort of the next step. This was a little bit of work done. Most of this work, by the way, that I'm talking about with Herculaneum is currently being run through a project called the Scroll Prize or the Vesuvius Challenge, depending on what you would talk about, where a lot of this newer development is happening internally there. One of the things that they tested was, can I fit, if I know it was a spiral, can I deform a parameterized spiral and have it fit to the slice structure that I see? And in fact, in some small cases, this actually can work fairly well. by doing a global optimization of the surface. And you can take something like this spiral that's fitted to the slice you see, and you can use that to correct the volume so that you get a very nice regularized representation of the scroll. It's much easier to segment than all of the deformed structure that we had before. The big problem here is that it's really, at this point, too complex to apply across the entire volume. This really works in very isolated cases. But the idea remains, is that there is a global structure we can eventually get to. And this sort of piecewise, pathwise approach is really just a step along that path to that global optimization that we're really trying to find. So now we're going to move on to the ink problem, the text problem. So for a moment, I want you to imagine sort of a layer of any page in cross-section. And you can imagine that you have ink on top of that. And that ink piles up a little bit on the top, or it soaks into the page, depending upon the material. But it is a distinct thin film on top of this substrate of the papyrus or paper or animal skin or whatever it is, so the material that it is that you're working with. It's coated in ink. For our texturing, at a very simplified level, what we want to do when we do segmentation is fit a surface somewhere near that ink. So ideally, we're going to follow, let's say, the middle of our base layer, our substrate. And then for every point on that surface, we want to build a neighborhood around that point and say, I am near ink, and I want some sort of filter function that tells me what the color of this should be in my output. Now, color here is sort of ambiguous because here mostly I've been talking about text, but again, it's content agnostic. So it could be actual true color that comes out of this filter function, or it could just be, is there ink or is it not ink? Well, I guess I should back up and say, this worked very well in very specific circumstances. When there is metal in an ink, in a CT scan, that metal shows up much brighter than the page on which that ink has been applied, because it's just more dense. So lots of ancient inks are sort of contaminated with iron or lead or any sort of high-density materials. And so like in this image, you could say the ink is brighter than the page. So a very simple filter function is, give me back the brightest pixel in the neighborhood. And this works remarkably well on a lot of materials, one of which we will talk about at the end of this, as we get to the end of this talk. But for Herculaneum, the problem is a little bit different. So here's the same sort of ink coated on a surface view as before. When you have a contaminant in the ink, you have a very nice bright layer sitting on top of and perhaps even absorbed into your surface. And like before, you can just say, simple filter function, return the brightest pixel in the right neighborhood. But for Herculaneum, where the materials have all been carbonized and where the ink itself is carbon-based ink, the contrast becomes something more like this. The surface structure is still the same. There is still a thin film on top, but in terms of the actual grayscale values that you have in the CT scan, they look practically the same, or at least not above the noise threshold that you'd really want if you want to try to do nice filtering. And this is very problematic. Here's a very large unwrapping of a Herculaneum scan. At the time, it was significantly larger than anything we'd ever produced. And if you look very closely at that surface structure in the CT data, this is filtering for that brightness. You can see all of the papyrus. But if there is ink in this image, I don't see it. Does anyone else see it? If you do see characters, please tell me now, because we've just solved a lot of problems and we're all going to be rich. Okay? Well, that's not entirely true. There are places where, when we do CT scans on open fragments, where we can actually compare against the ink that we know is there, there are some places where you can see the ink. So this sort of, jumping around, this sort of structure of the epsilon, I believe, this matches. This one's a little bit harder, but there is a little bit of a bump there. that V shape there sort of corresponds with that V shape. So there is structure here relating to the ink, but it's not bright, right? Like this structure here is the same value as the papyrus out here. If we didn't know that this was a character, it would be very difficult to just look at this image and say that's character. But there is actually a change there. Similar here, there is a pi there that one can see. And this one is perhaps the most important to really understanding how we're going to solve the Herculaneum problem. There is this bubble sort of pattern that you could imagine that if you had a liquid that dried on a surface, it would crack as it dried. This sort of crackle pattern, we call it, is actually very indicative of ink that is sort of coated on top of a papyrus structure. And so the question is, if this information is in the data, in the CT scan, but we can't see it, how do we see it? How do we make it visible for people to read? And the answer is actually this time machine learning and AI. The way that we really started on this was we had this notion that just because you can't see the ink in a CT scan doesn't mean it's not in the data. That there is actually, because of that ink that's been applied on the surface, there's a morphological change that you can detect. I think of this as a waffle. If you have a waffle and you pour some syrup into the little cells of the waffle, the surface shape has changed. You're not going up and down at regular intervals. Where there's syrup, you just go straight across. That morphology has changed, and we can detect that in CT. And so that's what's happening here. The ink is coating that rough papyrus surface, and we can sort of detect the change between rough and smooth to simplify, and thus render the ink visible. So we started from this problem with opened Herculaneum fragments where we could actually see the text, and we taught a machine learning, we did a machine learning process where we trained on this labeled data, and then we just predicted on data we hadn't seen, and let it just say for every pixel, is there ink at this pixel or is there not? And that is how we started to see text come out of this process. And that is how we got this first result. Strangely, this doesn't yet scale very well across scans, perhaps not so strangely. When you consider that every scroll in the Herculaneum collection was different, it was made by a different person, the papyrus was made by a different person, the papyrus was written on by potentially different scribes, the ink signatures or the ink recipes are not necessarily the same across scrolls, that the CT scan data is not actually super regularized in terms of how you get to capture it. There is variation when you capture CT scans. When you consider all of the different parameters, the outputs being different are actually not that surprising. And so generalizing from those small fragments into large scrolls becomes a much harder problem. For one individual scroll, and this is the real, I think, hook that has advanced us in the last few years, we've learned that you can use small ink patches like this to bootstrap the training process for that specific scroll. So now that we've detected these characters, we can add those characters to the training set, and that lets us learn the distribution of that particular CT scan and that particular scroll, and lets us start scaling up. And so I think 2 years ago, I can't remember, we got this, which is very hard to see, but this is 15 wraps, 15 columns from P. Hert Paris 4, a Herculaneum scroll currently housed in the Institut de France in Paris. And this is readable text that is currently being translated by our partner papyrologists in Italy. And we have actually a translation of this. I think I just don't have it in this slide. But this is all sort of coming from that bootstrapping. We would get a little bit of ink, add it to the training set. The papyrologists would verify that it was actually the correct text. We'd add it to the training set. We'd rerun the prediction, get more characters, on and on and on, and then we got this. So the next steps in texturing, at least for Herculaneum, are really about jointly growing the segmentation along with this texturing. If we need the bootstrapping, that also means we need larger surfaces that follow the ink, the actual surface very well. And we're really focused also on generalized models. How can we start to transfer what we've learned on a few fragments or on a few scrolls to the other scrolls. And again, there's a lot of variation, so that's quite difficult. And then also the ink properties within the scrolls, it's very important to start learning how we characterize those. What sort of contaminants are we seeing in the opened fragments? What sort of, like if there is lead in some of the ink, how present is that lead across the wider collection of Herculaneum? Because that changes the sort of features that we look for inside the CT data. And in fact, we already have evidence that these things are not as uniform as we thought. You know, I said that all the Herculaneum scrolls have this problem, the non-contrast problem. But let me introduce you to this scroll, which is from the Bodleian Library. We were very surprised when we CT scanned this scroll and did some unwrapping because without the fancy filtering, we actually saw lines of text that were just bright. This is just that max filter that I talked about before, the brightest pixel value. And we can actually see bits of text. I'll zoom in on it here so you can maybe make it out a little bit better. Yeah, there. That'd actually be better in small form. But, so there is, in some circumstances, contrast at the scroll level, or at the CT data level. In fact, when we have that sort of hook, we can really begin to exploit this sort of bootstrapping problem. The result we're sort of sitting on and refining at the moment is this scroll. And this at the moment is how much of that scroll that we have unwrapped. One of the big advancements here in segmentation is that we had good wrap structure, and then we began propagating a good wrap to adjacent layers by just shifting it sort of in radial space outward. So now we have lots of wraps and we know exactly where they are. And then on those wraps, our ink detection is doing much better. And so this whole unwrapping is about 7 meters long, which is a considerable part of the stage up here. I believe we're going to announce this officially in June. When we announce this, it will be a big deal because we're moving much further than just the 15 columns. We're actually moving to almost a complete text. Yes?
You said that your resolution requirement is higher than ordinary CT?
Yes.
So when you say, yes, Peter said you could CT scan. What kind of CT scan?
Yes. So for these scans, we're actually scanning at a synchrotron facility. We've scanned at quite a few. The Diamond Light Source in Oxford, England was the first one, and that's what this particular scroll was scanned on. Most of the scrolls that we're scanning now are happening at the European synchrotron facility in France. Partly because the beam properties of that facility are better, partly because they're better equipped to handle sort of scanning en masse. Lots of scanning reasons to do that, but yes, at a synchrotron, what you have is a very bright X-ray source with a parallel beam. So that lets us scan these much, much faster than, well, we can scan at much faster times and at higher resolution than we can get in sort of a conventional CT setup that you have like in a machine on campus or something. And yeah, the pixel sizes on this were 8 micron pixel sizes. So, you know, I think this scan was something like 10 or 12 terabytes once it was all reconstructed of just the raw data. And we're moving, actually, we find that the ink detection works much, much better at a 1 to 2 micron pixel resolution. So scale that data set size by 8 cubed, basically, because it's a volume, so it grows cubically. So these data sets are enormous, absolutely enormous. There's a whole other talk that could be given about just the infrastructure required to capture and reconstruct and process this data to get it workable at all. So this is the state of Herculaneum at the moment. We are getting many, many wraps of Herculaneum scrolls. They're still not perfect. The ink detection is still not perfect. But in the matter of a few years, we've gone from can this be done to it can be done to we are doing it. And those 3 steps in the matter of really about 5 or 6 years, very, very important and very, very exciting. So this is research. I would encourage, if anyone is interested in this, either to talk to Dr. Seals or myself, because we're still doing things here in Kentucky, but also to look into the Scroll Prize and Vesuvius Challenge, because this is open research. And all of this data is being made available online for anyone to just download and process on their own. And we welcome ideas from all sectors about how to solve these really complex challenges. So moving on from scrolls, though, I keep saying that we're content agnostic, but what exactly does that mean? I'm interested in learning about more than words, if anyone is familiar with the old song. I have a background in media production and photography and a lot of video things like that. And so I've always been very interested in the film roll problem. Film rolls are a lot like scrolls. They're rolled material. But there's a lot of damage that can happen to film rolls that really isolates an old part of film history, particularly 100 years ago, film history, where very important films were created, but now the materials have degraded to the point that you can't actually look at them without doing very intensive physical restoration of materials. It's called floating usually, where you float the emulsion off of its original film base and you replace it on a new stock of film, and then you get to do optical scanning, which sounds terrible. And I've always sort of had this thought that we can do better than that. If we can virtually unwrap a Herculaneum scroll, surely we can virtually unwrap a film roll. And we got the opportunity about 2 years ago. We were contacted by the Museum of Modern Art, and they had a collection of film rolls where some of the rolls they could physically open, and they have optically scanned them, but some of them are actually quite fragile and brittle. And so if they tried to open them, they're sort of glass-like. They would just sort of break and shatter. So they really wanted us to recover the images. And they're actually quite important. They're from a collection captured by Etienne Jules Marais, who was working around the same time as Muybridge, who was one of the early sort of film pioneers. Marais was a physiologist, and he was using motion picture to study the way that humans and animals move, because a lot of wasn't really known at the time about what happens, like when a horse runs. Does his feet leave the ground? This was a very important question that Marais and Muybridge answered, both independently and with motion picture. So obviously we said, yes, I want to do this film restoration project. This is great. Let's scan them. But fundamentally, though, how do we think about the virtual unwrapping task for film? It's actually very important, because we've been thinking about inks. So if you're not familiar with how film is formed, you have sort of a film base, glass, cellulose, some sort of base material, on which you put a photosensitive emulsion layer, which is really just saying the photosensitive material sort of floating in a thick liquid. And you expose that to light to capture an image, and then when you develop that photosensitive material, what's left is sort of a shadow or a negative of the photograph that you've taken. Key to this, though, is that the negative material, the emulsion light material, is often a silver-based material. When it's exposed to light, it creates silver crystals. What's left behind after development is a layer of silver where it was exposed to light, and nothing where it wasn't exposed to light. And that gives you the negative images. And when you project light back through a negative, where the silver was blocks the light, and where it wasn't, the light comes through, and you get to re-invert it. Sort of a double Boolean thing here, right? Just to sort of show this in the cross-section view, because I think about this, you have a base, you have a light-sensitive emulsion. Photons come in, and where they strike the surface, it turns dark because there's silver there. You develop that film, washing away everything that wasn't exposed, and now you have sort of a gradient of silver across the surface. And when you project light back through, the light gets blocked by the silver and strikes a light-sensitive paper, which turns dark now, where it wasn't hit, or where it was hit. No, it wasn't hit, because it's white. Anyway, the point is, you have this light-blocking effect happening because of the silver. And in fact, that is exactly what would happen if you CT scan one of these. The silver is much more dense than cellulose in the base layer, and so the silver absorbs the X-rays more than the base layer of the film, And you get a nice, very direct corollary between what happens in the photographic developing process and what you get in a CT scan. So the Museum of Modern Art shipped us about 7 rolls, and we scanned those here in a CT scanner, which is currently in Hardiman, shown here on the left. And we get this sort of cross-sectional image for a lot of them, but not all of them. And just to sort of orient you, if this is the cross-sectional view, this is the 3D view that when we look at the full 3D data combined. So you get the full length of the roll to all of the wraps. Yes? Mm-hmm. Here, we're looking for silver. The silver that comes on the emulsion from the exposed photograph. It actually is almost exactly like this toy example. You have a film-based layer that is a light gray, and the emulsion of the film with silver is actually bright. And so, in some sense, it's the ideal case because the silver absorbs X-rays and has a very nice natural contrast in the raw data. So when I play these cross-sectional slices, that's actually showing the segmentations that we have on this particular roll. It's quite regular. We're still sort of doing the piecewise growing in this animation, but it's a very regular spiral structure. It's great. It's like the perfect case for us. And when you map that, do the unwrapping, and use that max filter looking for the bright pixels close to the surface, you get an image like this, which is a full restoration of one frame. And just to orient you with respect to that 3D data, the width of the frame corresponds to the length of this roll, and multiple frames sort of wrap radially around the different reps of the roll. And in small and set, you can see all of the frames that we've unwrapped from this particular roll doing this process. Now the next steps are, I showed you one roll. We have 7 rolls, some of which actually look like rolls, some of which look like partial rolls, and some of which are spaghetti. We have surfaces for all of these. Where it's actually a nice spiral, we have complete surfaces. I would say we probably have 80 to 90% of the recoverable surface area at this point, but we really want to get as close to 100 as we can on that. And there are edge cases, like with the Herculaneum rolls. We have places where the emulsion, shown here as a very bright layer, has broken apart from the base layer, which you can barely see. And so it's just sort of floating in space. It doesn't fit that spiral pattern that we had before. You have places where there are holes all the way through the surface, where layers come in and out of the slice view quite regularly. Breaks in the surface. CT artifacts, where the scroll moves slightly during the scan, and so now it just looks like a blur in that region. More broken layers. Places where the layers fold back on themselves. And of course, this weird surface structure, which is not spiral-like at all, down in the bottom right. So what we're working on with this right now is, again, like Herculaneum, that automatic segmentation. Here we actually can approach that global segmentation optimization that we want to happen with the Herculaneum scrolls, or at least we can get a lot closer than Herculaneum. And this is run for about, about a seventh of this whole CT scan for this particular roll, but run automatically in about 5 minutes. It's all of the wraps from this scroll in about 5 minutes, for this section in about 5 minutes. It's breaking apart on some of these edge cases, and so that's what we're dealing with at the moment. But we do think that for most of these rolls, we can get very, very good surface fits very, very quickly. And we will have something very near what you'd get if you could open these rolls and optically scan them. The other thing that we're interested in doing is sort of neural photo registration, or restoration rather. On the right, you have one of the frames from an optically scanned roll, and then one of our recovered frames on the left. There are artifacts from the CT scan that are here. while it's very similar to an optical scan, it's not exactly the same, but it's close enough that you could learn a transfer function between these two spaces. And you could actually learn what it should look like if you did a properly exposed optical scan of this particular film roll. So that's sort of ongoing research. And that was a whirlwind tour of virtual unwrapping and what we're currently working on. This is a very small subset of what we're working on. We have many materials from many different locations around the world where people are asking us, can you virtual unwrap X? And thus far, we've almost always said yes, or at least we'll try. But this really is a high-level view of what virtual unwrapping is, where the boundary is at the moment, where the very interesting problems are, and really thinking about where we can move beyond scrolls and into some of the more other spaces of heritage objects that are out there. Thank you very much.
For some questions. Okay. Any questions for Dr. Parker?
Hello. Okay. The AI aspect. I'm interested in the size of the models that you used. How,
Yeah.
to do this on a laptop or in the cloud, or how many parameters? I don't know. How do you characterize that? And did you have to come up with your own model, structure, neural structure, or is that even the way you did it?
Yeah, that's a good question. For most of the actual model architectures, we are really piggybacking off of existing, I'll say, computer vision models that already exist. So we started with the sort of standard convolutional neural net structure, but a 3D version, because we really wanted to capture local surface changes, but also in depth. That, while the model itself is not huge, adding that extra third dimension sort of explodes the training problem. You need a lot more training time to deal with what essentially you just cut your training data set, by an eighth or something when you start doing stuff like that. So yeah, in terms of architectures, now I think most of the architecture is using a timesformer, which is essentially the transformer version of a 3D net. And that seems to be working fairly well. We are getting to the point where we're starting to rethink, is this the right solution? Because we're finding some places where it feels like we're hitting the capacity in the ink detection outputs, where it feels like we should be getting sharper responses than we're getting. Like this is very nice and readable, but it's also a little blurry, right? And we think we can be sharper than that, especially if we're getting down to 1 or 2 micron pixel sizes. The input data is incredibly high resolution. We should be getting sharper text than that. So that's one question. In terms of actual capacity of the model, they're not huge. I mean, I think most of the models we're training on 2 or 3. The Scrollprize team operates largely in the cloud because they're distributed as they are, but they're not using hundreds of GPUs. I mean, it's like 4 or 5 at a time, and for maybe a day or 2 at a time. So nothing very intense. The large computational time is in preparing the data and feeding it into the network, getting enough examples into the network in 3D.
Well, I have a question. Okay. When you try to unwrap a film, gray label, it's possible to recover. Can you also recover color?
Yes, and in fact, that is an open question. I think it's possible, because I think what's very interesting about film in general is that you translate an image into physical space. Especially with color, you actually have layers of different dyes on top of the film base, and that you've essentially converted color into a spatial representation. And if you can do that, if you can learn where those different layers of colors are on the surface, you can recover color. So I think it's possible that we could directly do it. Now there are challenges there in that like most of the color film stocks are like not attenuating independently, right? They're usually like dyed layers rather than it's not like there's red is lead and green is some other material. So they would all sort of be the same color, and you have to differentiate.
Currently, you cannot do that yet.
Currently not with film, no.
All right.
Now what we have done with the Herculaneum scrolls is rather than producing, I've been showing these binary outputs. This is actually an output overlaid on top of the normal virtual unwrapping result. What we have done is colorized some of the photographs of these scrolls, and rather than having our network predict is there ink, is there not, we have it predict an RGB color. That actually works quite well. Let's see if I have an image of that briefly, because I think it's very cool. This is from our sort of first paper about that sort of ink problem. Right. This is a test, but this is a papyrus proxy that we made where across the columns it's carbon-based ink, and across the columns there's different numbers of applications. So here we applied ink once, here we applied it twice, here we applied it 6 times. So it gets thicker basically as you go on. And the normal binary output, of course, shows you the ink. This was our handle to say, yes, this is learnable, if the resolution is right. And then this was sort of colorized output, where you just learn the RGB value instead. So if you have good labels, you can sort of learn a nice thing. And this is where we really want to be with Herculaneum, is presenting papyrologists with something more like a photograph.
So you've shown us how the ink detection works really well with papyrus surfaces. Does it apply in more or less the same ways to other ancient writing surfaces like parchment or wood, or are there changes that you have to make to the software in order to read off parchment?
Yeah, and fundamentally, it works the same way. The real challenge is, how do those materials, usually how does the content signature change across those different modalities? So like ink on a vellum surface, quite simple. It's, in fact, in some ways much easier because the vellum is so smooth. It's much easier to detect ink in that circumstance. Harder, though, is especially with iron gall inks. Iron galls are sort of known for etching into the surface and creating holes. So there, actually, you have content encoded as a gap, which is a harder surface modeling problem. I want to intersect that gap, but it's a gap. So like, how do I render that is sort of an ongoing question, and one we've encountered. We've had quite a few etched materials and iron gall damaged materials that we've been working on. So you do have to adapt, but the principles all sort of apply.
Well, we have to stop.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you very, very much.